Let us take a closer look at the type of society the communists would have us live under, and see if we can get at the essence of these laws. Kropotkin said that, quote, 9/10 of those called lazy are people gone astray. He then suggests that given a job which answers their temperament and capacities, today we hear words like relate, alienation, and relevancy, these people would be productive workers for the community. What about that other 10% which couldn't adjust? Kropotkin doesn't elaborate, but he does say, quote, if not one of the thousands of groups of our federation will receive you, whatever be their motive, if you are absolutely incapable of producing anything useful, or if you refuse to do it, then live like an isolated man. That is what could be done in a communal society in order to turn away sluggards if they become too numerous. Unquote. This is a pretty harsh sentence, considering that all the means of production have been confiscated in the name of the revolution. So we see that communism's law, put bluntly, becomes work or starve. This happens to be an individualist law too, but there is a difference between the two. The communist law is a man-made law, subject to man's emotions, rationalizations, and inconsistencies. The individualist law is nature's law, the law of gastric juices, if you will, a law which, like it or not, is beyond repeal. Although both laws use the same language, the difference in meaning is the difference between a commandment and a scientific observation. Individualist anarchists don't care where, when, or how a man earns a living, as long as he is not invasive about it. He may work 18 hours a day and buy a mansion to live the other 6 hours if he so chooses. Or he may feel like Thoreau did, that that man is richest whose pleasures are the cheapest, and work but a few hours a week to ensure his livelihood. I wonder what would happen to Thoreau under communism. Kropotkin would undoubtedly look upon him as a, quote, ghost of bourgeois society. And what would Thoreau say to Kropotkin's proposed contract? Quote, we undertake to give you the use of our houses, stores, streets, modes of transport, schools, museums, etc., on the condition that from 20 to 45 or 50 years of age, you consecrate 4 or 5 hours a day to some work recognized, by whom, as necessary to existence. 12 or 1,500 hours of work a year is all we ask of you. Unquote. I don't think it would be pulling the nose of reason to argue that Thoreau would object to these terms. But some communist anarchists would reject Kropotkin's idea of not giving to the unproductive worker according to his needs, even if he doesn't contribute according to his abilities. They might simply say that Kropotkin wasn't being a good communist when he wrote those lines, just as he wasn't being a good anarchist when he supported the Allies during World War I. But this idea, it seems to me, would be patently unjust to the poor workers who would have to support such parasites. How do these communists reconcile such an injustice? As best I can gather from the writings of the classical communist anarchists, they meet this problem in one of two ways. 1, they ignore it, or 2, they deny it. Malatesta takes the first approach. When asked how will production and distribution be organized, he replies that anarchists are not prophets, and that they have no blueprints for the future. Indeed, he likens this important question to asking when a man should go to bed and on what days he should cut his nails. Alexander Berkman takes the other approach, a notion apparently borrowed from the Marxists. He denies that unproductive men will exist after the revolution. Quote, in an anarchist society it will be the most useful and difficult toil that one will seek, rather than the lighter job. Unquote. Berkman's view of labor makes the Protestant work ethic sound positively mild by comparison. For example, quote, can you doubt that even the hardest toil would become a pleasure in an atmosphere of brotherhood and respect for labor? Unquote. Yes, I can doubt it. Or again, we can visualize the time when labor will have become a pleasant exercise, a joyous application of physical effort to the needs of the world. Unquote. And again, in apparent anticipation of Goebbels' famous dictum about the powers of repetition, quote, work will become a pleasure. Laziness will be unknown. It is hard to argue with such reasoning. It would be like a debate between Bertrand Russell and Billy Graham about the existence of heaven. How can you argue with faith? I won't even try. I'll just ask the reader next time he is at work to look around, at himself and his mates, and ask himself this question. After the revolution, will we really prefer this place to staying at home in bed or going off to the seashore? If there are enough people who can answer yes to this question, perhaps communism will work after all. But in the meantime, before building the barricades and shooting people for a cause of dubious certainty, I would suggest pondering these two items from the bourgeois and communist press, respectively. Quote, in Detroit's auto plants, weekend absenteeism has reached such proportions that a current bit of folk wisdom advises car buyers to steer clear of vehicles made on a Monday or Friday. Inexperienced substitute workers, so the caution goes, have a way of building bugs into a car. But in Italy lately, the warning might well include Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. At Fiat, the country's largest maker, absenteeism has jumped this year from the normal 4 or 5% to 12.5%. with as many as 18,000 workers failing to clock in for daily shifts at the company's Turin works. Alfa Romeo's rate has hit 15%, as hundreds of workers call in each day with malattia di comodo, a convenient illness. Italian auto workers seem to be doing no more than taking advantage of a very good deal. A new labor contract guarantees workers in state-controlled industries 180 days of sick leave a year at full pay, while workers in private firms such as Fiat get the same number of days at 75% of full pay. Unquote. When doctors employed by the state made an inspection visit in Turin, we are told that they found, quote, that only 20% of the indisposed workers they had visited were even mildly sick. Unquote. For those who think that this is just a bourgeois aberration, let us see what revolutionary Cuba, after 12 years of communism, has to say about such, quote, parasites. I translate from the official organ of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party. Quote, workers' discussion groups are being set up in all work centers to discuss the proposed law against laziness. These groups have already proven to be a valuable forum for the working class. During these assemblies, which for the moment are limited to pilot projects in the Havana area, workers have made original suggestions and posed timely questions, which lead one to believe that massive discussion of this type would make a notable contribution to the solution of the serious problem. An assembly of boiler repairmen in the Lujano district was representative of the general feeling of the workers. They demanded that action be taken against those parasitic students who have stopped going to classes regularly, or who, although attending classes, do just enough to get by. The workers were equally adamant about co-workers, who after a sickness or accident refuse to go back to their jobs but go on receiving their salaries for months without working. Questions were often accompanied by concrete proposals. For example, should criminals receive the same salaries on coming back to work from prison as when they left their jobs? The workers thought not, but they did think it all right that the revolutionary state accord a pension to the prisoner's family during his stay in the re-education center. At the Papelera Cubana factory, the workers made a suggestion which proved their contempt of these loafers. Habitual offenders should be punished in geometric proportion to the number of their crimes. They also proposed that workers who quit their jobs or were absent too often be condemned to a minimum not of 6 months, but of 1 year's imprisonment, and that the worker who refuses 3 times, work proposed by the Ministry of Labor, be considered automatically as a criminal and subject to punishment as such. The workers also expressed doubts about the scholastic deserters, ages 15 and 16, who aren't yet considered physically and mentally able to work, but who don't study either. They also cited the case of the self-employed man, who works only for his own selfish interests. The dock workers of Havana Port Zone 1 also had their meeting. They envisioned the possibility of making this law retroactive for those who have had a bad work attitude, stating forcefully that it wasn't a question of precedence, because otherwise the law could only be applied in those cases which occurred after its enactment. The harbor workers also proposed imprisonment for the sanctioned workers, and that in their opinion, the punishment of these parasites shouldn't be lifted until they could demonstrate a change of attitude. The steadfastness of the workers was clearly demonstrated when they demanded that punishments not be decided by the workers themselves in order to avoid possible leniency due to reasons of sympathy, sentimentality, etc. The workers also indicated that these parasites should not have the right to the social benefits accorded to other workers. Some workers considered imprisonment as a measure much too kind. As you can see, the workers have made many good proposals, which leads us to believe that with massive discussion, this new law will be considerably enriched. This is perhaps the best path to social legislation by the masses." Unquote. These two extracts clearly demonstrate that human nature remains pretty constant, independent of the social system the individual workman is subjected to. So it seems to me that unless human nature can somehow be miraculously transformed by the revolution, and that would be a revolution, some form of compulsion would be necessary in order to obtain from each according to his abilities. While on this point, I would like to ask my communist anarchist comrades just who is supposed to determine another person's abilities. We've seen from the above article that in Cuba, the Ministry of Labor makes this decision. How would it differ in an anarchist commune? If these anarchists are at all consistent with their professed desire for individual freedom, the only answer to this question is that the individual himself would be the sole judge of his abilities, and hence his profession. But this is ridiculous. Who, I wonder, is going to decide, of his own free will, that his real ability lies in collecting other people's garbage? And what about the man who thinks that he is the greatest artist since Leonardo da Vinci and decides to devote his life to painting mediocre landscapes while the community literally feeds his delusions with food from the communal warehouse? Few people, I dare say, would opt to do the necessary dirty work if they could choose with impunity any job, knowing that whatever they did, good or bad, hard or easy, they would still receive according to their needs. The individualist answer to this perennial question of who will do the dirty work is very simple. I will, if I'm paid well enough. I suspect even Mr. Heath could go down into the London sewers if he were paid £5 million per hour for doing it. Somewhere between this sum and what a sewer worker now gets is a just wage, which given a truly free society would be readily determined by competition. This brings us to the second half of the communist ideal: the distribution of goods according to need. The obvious question again arises, who is to decide what another man needs? Anarchists once more must leave that decision up to the individual involved. To do otherwise would be to invite tyranny, for who can better determine a person's needs than the person himself? But if the individual is to decide for himself what he needs, what is to prevent him from needing a yacht and his own private airplane? If you think we've got a consumer society now, what would it be like if everything was free for the needing? You may object that luxuries aren't needs, but that is just begging the question. What is a luxury, after all? To millions of people in the world today, food is a luxury. To the English, central heating is a luxury, while to the Americans, it's a necessity. The Nazi concentration camps painfully demonstrated just how little man actually needs. But is that the criterion communists would use for determining need? I should hope and think not. So it seems to me that this poses a definite dilemma for the communist anarchist. What do you do about unreasonable, irrational, or extravagant needs? What about the man who needs a new pair of shoes every month? Nonsense, you may say. No one needs new shoes that often. Well, how often then? Once a year? Every 5 years, perhaps? And who will decide? Then what about me? I live in Switzerland, and I'm crazy about grape jam. But unfortunately, the Swiss aren't. I feel a jam sandwich isn't a jam sandwich unless it's made with grape jam. But tell that to the Swiss. If Switzerland were a communist federation, there wouldn't be a single communal storehouse which would stock grape jam. If I were to go up to the commissar in charge of jams and ask him to put in a requisition for a few cases, he would think I was nuts. Grapes are for wine, he'd tell me with infallible logic, and more people drink wine than eat grape jam. But I'm a vegetarian, I plead, and just think of all the money I'm saving the commune by not eating any of that expensive meat. After which he would lecture me on the economics of jam making, tell me that a grape is more valuable in its liquid form, and chastise me for being a throwback to bourgeois decadence. And what about you, dear reader? Have you no individual idiosyncrasies? Perhaps you've got a thing about marshmallows. What if the workers in the marshmallow factories decide, under workers' control of course, that marshmallows are bad for your health, or too difficult to make, or just simply a capitalist plot? Are you to be denied the culinary delights that only marshmallows can offer, simply because some distant workers get it into their heads that a marshmallowless world would be a better world? But not only would distribution according to need hurt the consumer, it would be grossly unfair to the productive worker who actually makes the goods or performs the necessary services. Suppose, for example, that hard-working Farmer Brown goes to the communal warehouse with a load of freshly dug potatoes. While there, Brown decides he needs a new pair of boots. Unfortunately, there are only a few pairs in stock, since Jones the shoemaker quit his job, preferring to spend his days living off Brown's potatoes and writing sonnets about the good life. So, boots are rationed. The boot commissar agrees that Brown's boots are pretty shabby, but he points out Smith the astrologer is in even greater need. Could Brown come back in a month or so when both soles have worn through? Brown walks away in disgust, resolved never again to sweat over his potato patch. Even today, people are beginning to complain about the injustices of the relatively mild welfare state. Theodore Rosak writes that in British schools there has been a, quote, strong trend away from the sciences over the past 4 years, and that people are showing annoyed concern and loudly observing that the country is not spending its money to produce poets and Egyptologists, and then demanding a sharp cut in university grants and stipends. If people are upset now at the number of poets and Egyptologists that they are supporting, what would it be like if everyone could simply take up his favorite hobby as his chosen profession? I suspect it wouldn't be long before our professional chess players and mountain climbers found the warehouse stocks dwindling to nothing. Social unrest would surely increase in direct proportion to the height of the trash piling up on the doorsteps, and the subsequent yearning for the good old days would bring about the inevitable counter-revolution. Such would be the fate of the anarchist-communist utopia. Peter Kropotkin opens his chapter on consumption and production in the Conquest of Bread with the following words, quote, if you open the works of any economist, you will find that he begins with production, the analysis of means employed nowadays for the creation of wealth, division of labor, manufacture, machinery, accumulation of capital. From Adam Smith to Marx, all have proceeded along these lines. Only in the latter parts of their books do they treat of consumption, that is to say, of the means necessary to satisfy the needs of individuals. Perhaps you will say that this is logical. Before satisfying needs, you must first create the wherewithal to satisfy them. But before producing anything, must you not feel the need of it? Is it not necessity that first drove man to hunt, to raise cattle, to cultivate land, to make implements, and later on to invent machinery? Is it not the study of needs that should govern production? Unquote. When I first came upon these words, I must admit I was rather surprised. What have we here, I thought? Is the prince of anarchist communism actually going to come out in favor of the consumer? It didn't take long to find out that he wasn't. Most communists try very hard to ignore the fact that the sole purpose of production is consumption. But not Kropotkin. He first recognizes the fact, and then he ignores it. It's only a matter of 3 pages before he gets his head back into the sand and talks of, quote, how to reorganize production so as to really satisfy all needs, unquote. Under communism, it is not the consumer that counts, it is the producer. The consumer is looked upon with scorn, a loathsome if necessary evil. The worker, on the other hand, is depicted as all that is good and heroic. It is not by accident that the hammer and sickle find themselves as the symbols of the Russian workers' paradise. Can you honestly imagine a communist society raising the banner of bread and butter and declaring the advent of the consumer's paradise? If you can, your imagination is much more vivid than mine. But that's exactly what individualist anarchists would do. Instead of the communist workers' control, i.e. a producer's democracy, we advocate a consumer's democracy. Both democracies, like all democracies, would in fact be dictatorships. The question for anarchists is which dictatorship is the least oppressive. The answer should be obvious, but judging from the ratio of communists to individualists in the anarchist movement, apparently it's not, so perhaps I'd better explain. The workers in some given industry decide that item A should no longer be produced, and decide instead to manufacture item B. Now, consumer X, who never liked item A anyway, couldn't care less. But poor Y feels his life will never be the same without A. What can Y do? He's just a lone consumer, and consumers have no rights in this society. But maybe other Ys agree with him. A survey is taken, and it is shown that only 3% of all consumers regret the passing of A. But can't some compromise be arrived at? How about letting just one tiny factory make A's? Perhaps the workers agree to this accommodation. Perhaps not. In any case, the workers' decision is final. There is no appeal. The Ys are totally at the mercy of the workers, and if the decision is adverse, they'll just have to swallow hard and hope that next week item C isn't taken away as well. So much for the producer's dictatorship. Let's now take a look at the consumer's dictatorship. Consumers are finicky people. They want the best possible product at the lowest possible price. To achieve this end, they will use ruthless means. The fact that producer X asks more for his product than Y asks for his similar product is all that the consumer needs to know. He will mercilessly buy Y's over X's. The extenuating circumstances matter little to him. X may have 10 children and a mother-in-law to feed. The consumer still buys from Y. Such is the nature of the consumer's dictatorship over the producer. Now, there is a fundamental difference between these two dictatorships. In the one, the worker says to the consumer, "I will produce what I want, and if you don't like it, you can lump it." In the other, the consumer says to the worker, "You will produce what I want, and if you don't, I will take my business elsewhere." It doesn't take the sensitive antennae of an anarchist to see which of these two statements is the more authoritarian. The first leaves no room for argument. There are no exceptions, no loopholes for the dissident consumer to crawl through. The second, on the other hand, leaves a loophole so big that it is limited only by the worker's imagination and abilities. If a producer is not doing as well as his competitor, there's a reason for it. He may not be suited for that particular work, in which case he will change jobs. He may be charging too much for his goods or services, in which case he will have to lower his costs, profits, and/or overhead to meet the competition. But one thing should be made clear. Each worker is also a consumer, and what the individual loses in his role as producer by having to cut his costs down to the competitive market level, he makes up in his role as consumer by being able to buy at the lowest possible prices.